We are back at it with our next video in our authoritarian state series on Joseph Stalin's regime in the Soviet Union with the establishment of his Soviet state. So Stalin is going to push towards the rapid modernization of the Soviet economy and the creation of a complete command or like government controlled economy within the Soviet Union. Stalin will refer to this as the second revolution in Russia. This is going to place Stalin right alongside Vladimir Lenin as a revolutionary leader. So he is not playing second fiddle to anybody in the history of the Soviet Union. There's going to be two arms to this second revolution: collectivization of agriculture, the end of private ownership of agricultural land, and rapid industrialization in the Soviet Union to turn the Soviet Union into a modern industrialized state. Collectivization calls for the bringing together of private farms, maybe 50 to 100, into one larger government collective. There's many reasons for this. Joseph Stalin and this philosophy believed that this would bring greater efficiency to the Soviet Union and its farmland. For example, the collective could have industrial agricultural machinery working on the farms, whereas the smaller individual private plots might not have been able to afford that. The Soviet Union would need both industrial investments and manpower, and this collectivization process was believed to be able to provide for both of those. Because the Soviet Union has land, the vast agricultural productive capabilities within the Soviet Union could provide both of those things, where surplus grains could be sold in international markets to bring in capital for internal industrialization. And then the surplus manpower, as the collective farms would be more efficient, you wouldn't need as many farmers. They could be sent to the cities to work as industrial workers. Now, this collectivization goes hand in hand with the targeting of the kulak class. The kulaks were peasants with more resources. They were peasants that held some land, that had their own private lands, and they would be accused within the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin of hoarding production to artificially drive up prices to benefit themselves. Stalin will make what is known as de-kulakization a national policy. Poorer peasants would join in on this, on the government-sanctioned targeting and attacks against the kulak class. The government secret police, the OGPU, would arrest and deport hundreds of thousands of kulaks. And by the end, over 30,000 of the kulak class would be killed, over 2 million deported and sent to northern Siberian gulag and work camps. Now, there is some resistance to this collectivization. Millions of peasants did try to resist through arson and burning stores of food that the government was confiscating. There were rural protests, but the threats of violence and deportation were real, and they ultimately silenced much of this resistance. There are tremendous and tragic consequences to this collectivization process. The Soviet Union will go through a disastrous famine in the early 1930s. Millions will die, especially in Ukraine, where the government confiscation of agricultural production led to an event in Ukraine known as the Holodomor, where ultimately 3 to 5 million Ukrainians would die, mostly of famine. We would see mass internal migrations, most of it forced by the government. The government would control the media to try to hide the consequences of this forced collectivization from the public. But there was a workforce for industrialization that was manufactured, and that would allow for the next arm of Stalin's economic aims. Stalin would push for the development of what he called a war economy. Now, the Soviet Union wasn't at war at this point, but war is a powerful driver of propaganda. And so Stalin argued that the state was at war against Russia's agrarian past, and that it was at war against its capitalist foes beyond their border. And the development of iron and steel and oil industries within the Soviet state could offer a defense against these state adversaries. Soviet industrialization is going to come in the form of a series of 5-year plans, literally just a goal to reach within 5 years. And this would be followed by state propaganda celebrating the efforts of the state. The Soviet Gosplan, which was their economic planning agency, would develop quotas for production of steel and iron and coal. And these were actually just targets. There was no means to actually achieve these goals. They were just goals set by the state. And in fact, within the 5-year plans, depending on how things were going, the goals could be increased. So this was always a moving goalpost for Soviet industrial production. The first 5-year plan began in 1928, and then they'd run essentially every 5 years, except during World War II. The Second World War would pause the 5-year plans, and then they'd be resumed afterwards. Now, the effects of the 5-year plans are multifold. The first 5-year plan did result in increased industrial production, though gains in steel and chemicals were more modest. Coal, iron, and electricity production surged during this first 5-year plan. The development of textiles, however, declined as heavy industry was seen as more valuable. But we do see many inefficiencies develop. Some sectors in the Soviet economy would overproduce, while other sectors underproduced, and this would ultimately disrupt supply chains and contribute to hoarding issues by individual factories to make sure that they had what they needed to produce, shortchanging others. Quality standards were low. The only thing that mattered was the quantity of production, so not a lot of oversight over quality. Heavy industrial production, though, did see dramatic increases, but living standards were low in the Soviet Union. In fact, for many, they were worse than they were prior to the development of these 5-year plans, and consumer goods in the Soviet Union were scarce. We'll see you next time.